My brother lied. My family disowned me and left me to rot. Now they're begging me to save them from homelessness. I let them lose everything. Let me tell you exactly who I am before I tell you what they did to me, because context matters. And I'm not interested in your sympathy. I'm interested in you understanding how this was possible. My name is Xander Kale, eldest son of Garen Kale, who built Kale & Sons Construction over 30 years with blueprints spread across a kitchen table and hands that were permanently roughed up by the time I was old enough to notice. The company handled commercial builds, warehouses, mid-rise retrofits, municipal contracts. Not flashy, solid. The kind of business that runs on reputation and tight margins and knowing exactly where every dollar is going. I knew where every dollar was going. That was essentially my function from the time I was 16 and started working summers in the yard. By my late 20s I was managing subcontractor relationships, reviewing bid packages, cross-referencing invoices against project budgets. Garen was the face, client dinners, handshakes, the charm offensive that kept contracts coming in. I was the infrastructure behind that. I didn't need credit for it. The work got done and the company made money, and that was the point. Then there was Colby, 3 years younger than me. Never once showed up to a job site in anything that would get dirty. Garen gave him the title operations coordinator when he was 24, which was a generous name for someone who mostly forwarded emails and showed up to meetings with coffee. I'm not saying Colby was stupid. He wasn't. He was smart in a specific way that has nothing to do with competence and everything to do with reading people. He could walk into a room and within 10 minutes have everyone convinced he was the most capable person in it. He'd had that since he was a kid. Our parents loved it. I understood it for what it was. I thought it was manageable. I thought we were fine. I want to be precise about the day everything ended, because I've replayed it enough times that I can account for every detail. It was a Sunday, early afternoon. The kind of family gathering that happened at our parents' house every few weeks. Nothing special. Just Garen's version of keeping everyone connected. My younger sister Tinsley was there, which mostly meant she was positioned near the food with her phone out, filming content for whatever her current platform was. She treated every family event like location scouting. I was in the kitchen with Garen when Colby came through the front door. He was holding a manila folder, and his face, I want to be specific about this, his face was doing something I recognized immediately as performance. That particular arrangement of features that signals reluctant duty. The man who has to deliver terrible news and wishes he didn't. He asked to speak to Garen privately. Garen said whatever it was, say it here. So Colby laid the folder on the kitchen table and opened it. Printed bank statements, my name on the accounts, transaction records spanning 2 years, withdrawals, transfers, a pattern that someone had clearly worked to make look deliberate. The total when you added it up was $487,000. Dad, Colby said, voice dropping just low enough to sound pained. I didn't want to believe it either. Garen picked up the pages, read them, didn't look at me once. My mother came in from the living room. She must have caught the shift in the room's energy. Within 40 seconds of understanding what she was looking at, she was at full volume, not asking questions, not waiting for a response, calling me a thief, calling me a disgrace, saying I had looked my father in the eyes every single day while stealing from everything he'd spent his life building. I heard the phone camera click on. Tinsley, from the doorway. I stood completely still and I looked at those papers and I noticed 3 things. 1. The font wasn't right. Bank-issued statements have a specific formatting standard. This was close but not exact, slightly off in the header spacing. 2. One of the routing numbers in the account details didn't match mine. Not dramatically. 1 digit transposed, but wrong. 3. Colby had not made direct eye contact with me since he walked through the door. I started to speak. I said Garen, and my father looked up from the pages for the first time and said, flatly and finally, I don't want to hear it. 4 words, 30 years of being his son, and that's the door closing. I went to my old room, pulled my duffel bag from the closet, packed what mattered, documents, laptop, some clothes. The whole thing took maybe 8 minutes. On my way out I stopped in front of Colby, who was still standing in the kitchen with the folder on the table between us. I didn't raise my voice. There was no point. One day, I said, you'll choke on this lie. Then I walked out the front door while Tinsley filmed my back. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known standing in that driveway, was that while I was loading that bag, Colby was already 3 months behind on payments to people who don't send polite reminders. I didn't know that yet, but I was going to find out. The first place I lived after walking out was a shared house 12 minutes from a freight terminal on the east side of the city. 4 bedrooms, 6 people, 1 bathroom with a shower that ran cold if you weren't in it by 5 a.m. My room had a window that faced a concrete wall and a radiator that clicked all night like it was trying to communicate something. I got a job on the overnight dock crew within a week. Loading, unloading, moving freight in and out of containers from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The work was physical enough to be exhausting and repetitive enough to leave my mind completely alone with itself, which in those early months was not a comfortable place to be. But I needed the exhaustion. It was the only thing keeping me from making decisions based on emotion, and emotional decisions were something I could not afford. I want to be honest about those first few months, not to generate sympathy, but because the reality of them is important to what came later. I was angry, not loudly. The loud version of anger burns through itself and leaves you with nothing. What I had was the quiet kind that settles into the body and becomes something else over time, something more useful. I let it settle. I didn't call anyone, didn't try to clear my name publicly, didn't contact a lawyer in a panic. I went to work. I came home. I slept 4 hours. I went back. About 6 weeks in, I ordered the first textbook. Forensic accounting. Used copy, spine cracked. Previous owner had highlighted half of it in yellow. I read it at the folding table in my room after shifts, still in my work clothes, eating whatever was cheap and fast. Then I ordered another one. Corporate fraud detection. Then one on asset tracing. Then I found an online certification program in financial forensics that ran 3 nights a week and cost less than a month of my doc wages. I want to be clear about why I was doing this. I didn't have a plan yet. I just knew that whatever Colby had done, and I knew he'd done something, the fake statements were obvious to anyone who looked carefully. Understanding it completely was going to require a specific kind of knowledge. So I built the knowledge, the same way I'd always operated, from the foundation up, without shortcuts. Meanwhile, I was getting fragments of what was happening back home through Desta Wren, a mutual family contact, someone I'd known for years who had the decency to stay quietly in touch without making it dramatic. She didn't volunteer information constantly, but occasionally she'd pass something along. And what she passed along, piece by piece over those first 2 years, was worse than I expected. Within weeks of me leaving, Garen had handed Colby full operational authority over the business. Not temporary, not conditional. Xander's gone. Here are his access codes. Here is his office. Here are his vendor contacts. Go. Garen started bringing Colby to industry events and introducing him as the man who'd stepped up when it mattered. He told people the company was in good hands. He believed it completely. Morel was doing her own version of this in every social circle she had. She wasn't just moving on from the situation. She was actively building a narrative around it. Xander had always been difficult. Colby had always been the responsible one, and she just never wanted to say it out loud before. She said this to relatives, to neighbors, to women she had lunch with on Thursdays. She constructed Colby's reputation on top of mine like she was laying a foundation. And she did it with the total conviction of someone who is fully committed to a story. Tinsley made it content. Twice over 4 years. Once about 14 months after I left. Once in year 3. My name came up in mutual online circles and she posted about it. Not ambiguously. By name. Called me a thief both times. Got engagement off it. The second post had comments. People I'd known for years, agreeing with her, because why would they question it? I found out about both posts through Desta. I screenshotted them both. Filed them. Kept moving. 2 years in, I enrolled in a night class on corporate law fundamentals. That's where I met Wayne Drake, older, former auditor, the kind of drive that only comes from decades of watching people lie badly about money. He recognized something in me during a case study discussion that apparently wasn't common in that room. After class he asked what I was actually trying to do. I told him the short version. He didn't flinch. He said he knew people. Those people turned out to be Priya Solano, tax attorney, private practice, precise in the way that makes opposing counsel nervous, and Oscar Fenn, who moved investment capital through anonymous structures with the kind of quiet efficiency that doesn't get discussed in public. The three of them had worked together before. They were careful about who they brought in. They brought me in. We built Vonda Holdings. No public profile, no branding, just a registered entity that acquired distressed commercial debt and restructured it for return. I was the analytical engine. Oscar handled structure. Priya handled exposure. When connected us to deal flow. Within 18 months we had real capital behind us. Within 3 years we had enough that I could afford to look backward. I hired Rule Marsh, ex-fraud division, recommended by Wen, the kind of man who finds things people believed were buried. I gave him one task. Pull everything on Kale & Sons Construction's financials going back 5 years. Every account, every vendor, every signatory on every document. He took 4 weeks. When he called, he didn't open with a summary. He said, "The company isn't in trouble, Xander. It's in free fall. And your brother doesn't just owe money, he owes it to the kind of people who've started showing up at your father's job sites." I asked Rule to send me everything and to walk me through it in person. We met 3 days later at a coffee shop near his office, corner table, away from the door, which I'd noticed was his instinct in every public space. Old habits from fraud division. He put a bound report on the table between us, about 40 pages, tabbed by section. He ordered black coffee and didn't touch it. He just watched me read. "I'm going to tell you what was in that report. All of it. Because I need you to understand the full shape of what Colby built, not just the scale, but the architecture, the way it was constructed piece by piece, each layer designed to hold up just long enough to need the next one." The first section covered what Rule called the initial bleed. Starting approximately 1 year after I was removed from the company, Colby began diverting funds from a business expense account he'd inherited full access to after my exit. He wasn't moving large amounts at first, controlled withdrawals, the kind that don't trigger immediate scrutiny if the books are being managed by someone who trusts you. He was routing this money into crypto positions, not through any sophisticated vehicle, through a personal trading account, chasing volatile assets, making decisions that someone with actual financial training would recognize immediately as impulsive and high risk. He lost, consistently and significantly. When a position collapsed, he didn't cut it. He doubled down. When a sector dropped, he moved into something more volatile, trying to recover. Over approximately 18 months, he burned through $310,000 in company capital. He buried every dollar of it inside inflated vendor invoices, phantom suppliers, fabricated material costs, line items dressed up to look like standard construction overhead. If you weren't looking for it, it read like a busy quarter. If you were looking for it, it was obvious within an afternoon. I turned to the second tab. When the crypto strategy stopped working, when there was simply nothing left to chase, Colby moved to private lenders, not banks, the kind of short-term lending arrangements that don't require board approval, don't generate formal documentation through standard channels, and carry interest rates that assume the borrower is desperate. He took 3 separate loans over a period of 8 months, totaling just under $180,000. He used the company's credit standing as implied backing without ever formally disclosing the arrangements to Guerin. He told the lenders the business was solid. He told Guerin nothing. He was borrowing from the second lender to make payments on the first. By the time the third loan came through, he was using it to service the combined interest on the previous 2. The third tab was the one Rule had flagged on the phone. The gambling was separate from the crypto, different mechanism, different networks, different creditors. Rule had traced a pattern of wire transfers to offshore accounts connected to private poker networks operating across 3 states. This wasn't recreational. The amounts, the frequency, the escalation, this was compulsive in the clinical sense. Colby had accumulated approximately $95,000 in losses owed to a network that Rule's notes described carefully as connected to regional private lending with enforcement capacity, which is a precise way of saying the people who had started appearing at Guerin's job sites were not there about construction contracts. I sat with those 3 sections for a while. Then I turned to the 4th tab, which Rule had marked with a red divider. This was the collateral documentation. Over a period of 14 months, running parallel to the loan accumulation, Colby had been presenting Guerin with documents to sign. He framed them as routine business filings, refinancing agreements, operational authorizations, the kind of administrative paperwork that a business owner signs because the person handing it to him is his son and his trusted operations lead and has never given him reason to look twice. Guerin signed them. What he was actually authorizing, spread across those documents in language buried deep enough that you'd need to know what you were looking for to find it, was a series of agreements placing the family home and the company's primary assets as collateral against Colby's accumulated private debt. The family home that Guerin and Morrell had owned outright for 11 years. The equipment that represented the company's entire operational capacity. All of it, quietly repositioned as leverage for debts Guerin didn't know existed. By the time Rule handed me that report, foreclosure notices had already been filed and physically posted to the family home. 2 creditors had initiated formal legal proceedings. The company's equipment was flagged for potential repossession. A regional trade publication had already run a small piece about Kale and Son's instability that was beginning to circulate in contractor circles. I closed the report. Rule finished his coffee finally, watching me. "How do you want to handle it?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. I took 72 hours, went back to my apartment, went through every page myself, mapped the full timeline, verified the figures against what I knew about the company's cash flow from my own years inside it. I wasn't going to move on incomplete information. I wasn't going to move on emotion. On the 3rd morning, I called Priya. "I need to know if we can acquire the debt," I said. "The liens, the mortgage note, the private loans, all of it." She was quiet for a moment. "Which part?" she asked. "All of it." She told me she'd make calls and get back to me within 48 hours. Those 48 hours were the longest I'd sat still in 4 years. When she called back, her voice was measured in the way it gets when she has something significant to deliver and wants to make sure you're actually ready to receive it. "The primary creditor is willing to negotiate," she said. "But Xander, if Vanta acquires this position, you become the entity foreclosing on your father's house. You understand exactly what that means?" "Yes, a beat. And you're comfortable with that?" I looked out the window, thought about a Sunday afternoon. A manila folder. 4 words from a man who didn't want to hear it. "Call them back," I said. Priya called back the primary creditor that same afternoon. The lending group had been sitting on a messy, partially secured debt package tied to a construction company that was visibly deteriorating and a borrower who had stopped returning calls. From their position, Vanta Holdings offering a clean negotiated settlement was not a complicated decision. They wanted out. We were offering out. The only question was price, and Priya is very good at price. The negotiation took 11 days. I stayed out of it entirely and let her work. That was the arrangement. Priya handles exposure, meaning she handles everything that involves another party's lawyers. I reviewed every draft that came back, flagged 2 clauses that needed tightening, and otherwise kept my hands off the process. Oscar, meanwhile, was building the acquisition vehicle, a subsidiary entity under Vanta, clean registration, no Kale family name appearing anywhere in the ownership chain at any level. If someone pulled the paperwork, they'd find a legitimate holdings company with a legitimate acquisition history. They'd find nothing that connected it to me until I decided they should. What Vanta acquired when the deal closed: the construction company's primary operating liens, the collateralized home mortgage note, meaning the debt instrument that Colby had quietly attached to Guerin and Morel's family home across those 14 months of forged authorizations, and 2 of the 3 outstanding private loans Colby had taken from non-bank lenders. The third loan, the one connected to the creditors whose representatives had been appearing at Guerin's job sites, I left deliberately untouched. Those men operated on their own timeline and by their own methods. Colby had created the problem entirely by himself, and I had no interest in inserting myself between him and its consequences. That debt would find him without my help. With the acquisition closed and recorded, Vanta Holdings held legal authority to formally call the debt, initiate foreclosure proceedings on both the business assets and the family home, and, if payment in full wasn't made within the statutory window, which it absolutely wasn't going to be, move to complete liquidation. I want to be precise about something. I was not moving fast through any of this. Fast is how you make mistakes. Fast is how you hand someone a procedural error that becomes a legal challenge that unravels everything you spent 4 years building. I reviewed every document. Priya verified every clause. Oscar confirmed every structural detail. We ran it through 3 separate checks before anything was filed or recorded. It had to be airtight, not just legally, but in the way that matters personally. I was not going to win this badly. I was going to win it correctly, the way you win something when you want it to be permanent. Around this time, Oscar suggested I move. Not for any dramatic reason, just that the firm's principals operating from shared housing and freight terminal neighborhoods created an unnecessary image problem for Vanta when dealing with institutional counterparties. He was right. I found a penthouse in Houston, floor-to-ceiling glass, city spread out below, the kind of space that signals a specific level of operational seriousness without requiring any explanation. I describe it that way because I don't want to oversell it. It's a nice apartment. I worked at the kitchen table there the same way I worked at the folding one in the shared house. The view was better. The coffee was the same. Meanwhile, the family's situation was becoming publicly visible in ways that couldn't be managed anymore. A regional trade publication ran a piece on Kale and Son's financial instability. Nothing detailed, just enough to circulate in contractor circles and make subcontractors nervous. 3 of them pulled out of active projects within 2 weeks of the piece running. Guerin was on the phone constantly, I was told, trying to reassure people. Colby was largely unreachable, telling the few people who could get him on the line that he was working on solutions, which was not a thing that was happening. Then the foreclosure notices were physically posted to the family home. That's when Morel started making calls. Desta reached out to me carefully, the way she always communicated, without pressure, just passing information. She said Morel had been asking around trying to find a way to reach me. That Guerin had been quiet about it but was clearly in the same position. I told Desta I appreciated her letting me know. I didn't ask her to pass anything back. I waited 3 more weeks, not out of cruelty, out of necessity. Every procedural requirement needed to be fully met and recorded before I made any contact. Nothing could be in motion when I opened that door. Everything had to already be done. Then I had Priya's office send a single message from their line to Guerin's personal number. If the family wishes to discuss the outstanding debts currently held by Vanta Holdings, I am available Thursday at 2 p.m. The address is attached. No name, no firm name beyond Vanta, no explanation. Guerin called the number back twice. Priya's assistant confirmed the meeting and nothing else. He didn't know it was me. None of them did. Thursday arrived cold and clear. I was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window with coffee when I heard the elevator engage from the lobby level. I didn't turn around immediately. I listened to the doors open behind me. Morel's heels on the hardwood first. Then Guerin's slower step. Then Tinsley. I could tell by the pause, the hesitation, the way she always held back in unfamiliar spaces. And then a 4th set of footsteps that stopped completely the moment they crossed the threshold. I turned around. Colby was standing at the edge of the room looking at my face, and every drop of color had left his. Nobody spoke for a long moment. That moment had weight to it, not the dramatic kind you read about, just the plain, functional weight of 4 people standing in a room processing something they weren't prepared for. Morel's expression moved through shock, then something that tried to be relief, then landed somewhere uncertain. Guerin looked at me the way you look at something you thought you'd lost and aren't sure yet how to feel about finding. Tinsley stayed back near the elevator, arms folded across herself, eyes moving around the apartment like she was taking inventory. Colby didn't move, didn't speak. He was reading the room, the space, the view, the city laid out behind me through the glass, the legal folders on the table, Priya's business card sitting on top of them. Calculating. I could see it happening. He was trying to figure out exactly what I held before he committed to any position. I let him calculate. Then I said, "Sit down." I offered water. Nothing else. Pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down myself and waited. Morel came toward me first. She said my name, just my name, twice, and her voice was doing something complicated that I recognized as genuine shock layered over genuine guilt layered over 4 years of committed self-justification. She started to reach for my arm. I didn't pull away dramatically. I just didn't engage with it. I kept my eyes on the table and waited for everyone to sit. Garen sat down across from me. He looked older than I'd been tracking in my head, not just physically, but in the way a person looks when something has been pulling at them for long enough that it starts showing through. He folded his hands on the table and looked at me steadily and didn't perform anything. Colby finally moved to the last chair, sat down slowly, still hadn't spoken. Garen opened his mouth. Son, I stopped him, not unkindly, but with complete clarity, because I needed this conversation to move in one direction. Let's talk about why you're here, I said. I opened the first folder and walked them through the Vonda Holdings documentation. Not quickly, methodically, in plain language, without legal jargon, because I wanted every person at that table to understand exactly what they were hearing. The acquisition, the liens, the mortgage note, the statutory window, what liquidation meant in practical terms for the business assets and for the house. I watched Colby's face during the specific moment he understood that the entity foreclosing on his family wasn't some distant financial institution. It was a company I controlled. That the debt he had spent years constructing and concealing had been purchased by the person he'd handed fake bank statements to 4 years ago at a Sunday dinner. His jaw tightened. That was all he gave me, but it was enough. Morel pivoted. I'd expected it. She moved from shock into apology the way people do when they realize the situation requires a different tool. It was extensive. She brought up my childhood, my years in the business, how hard I'd worked, how much she'd missed me, how she'd thought about reaching out. Her voice stayed controlled but her hands weren't. I let her finish every word. Then I said, 4 years ago you called me a disgrace and watched Colby hand your husband fake bank statements. You didn't ask one question. The room went quiet in a specific way. Tinsley shifted in her chair, started to say something about not having known the full picture, that she'd only heard what everyone else heard and couldn't be expected to. You filmed it, I said. I looked at her directly. You posted about it twice. By name. She stopped talking. Garen had been quiet through all of this. When he finally spoke, it wasn't a defense. It wasn't a negotiation. He looked at me across the table and said, plainly and without any decoration, I should have listened to you. Just that. No elaboration. I held that for a moment. It landed the way I always knew it would if it ever came, not with relief, not with satisfaction, just with the dull recognition of a thing arriving too late to change what it would have changed. I acknowledged it with a nod, didn't reward it, moved forward. Colby made his move. He stood up, voice rising, controlled anger shifting into something more aggressive, and called it a vendetta. Said the documentation would be challenged. Said he had his own legal representation who would examine the acquisition structure and find the flaw in it and unwind the entire thing. He was leaning forward with both hands on the table, and for a moment I could see exactly what he looked like standing in that kitchen 4 years ago, holding a manila folder and performing the role of reluctant truth-teller. I let him finish. Then I slid a folder across the table to him. He looked at it, looked at me, opened it. Inside was Rule Marcia's complete investigative report, tabbed, documented, annotated, the crypto trading records and the buried vendor invoices, the 3 private loan agreements, the gambling transfer history and the names of the creditors whose people had been visiting Garen's job sites, the full chain of documents Colby had fed Garen to sign over those 14 months, and at the back, separated by a red tab, a forensic analysis of the bank statements Colby had presented at that Sunday dinner, page-by-page comparison against authentic bank-issued formatting, metadata extraction from the original digital files showing they were created using a PDF editor on a personal device, 11 days before that Sunday dinner. The device ID matched Colby's personal laptop, which Rule had been able to cross-reference through a separate data point I won't detail here for legal reasons that Priya had flagged from the start. Colby read the last section. Then he closed the folder. The aggressive posture was gone. He sat back down. Those documents were fabricated, I said. You know it. I know it. And a complete copy of that report has already been submitted to the fraud division. The room was absolutely still. Colby looked at the folder in front of him for a long moment. When he looked up his voice had dropped to something I'd never heard from him before. Not charming, not aggressive, just stripped of everything that usually covered it. What do you want? He asked. I stood up, straightened my jacket. I already have it. I turned toward the window, and then his chair scraped back hard and his hand was on my arm. Not violent, just desperate, the grip of someone who has run out of every other option and is now holding on to the last physical thing available. You can't take the house, he said, voice cracking at the edges. Mom and Dad didn't do anything. This isn't on them. This is on me. Whatever you think I did, just don't take the house. I looked down at his hand on my arm. He let go. You should have thought about that, I said, 4 years ago. I turned back to the window. Below, on the street, 2 county vehicles were pulling slowly to the curb in front of the building. Right on time. Actually a few minutes ahead of schedule. The deputies are early, I said, Behind me, I heard Colby's chair hit the floor. I didn't go to the house. I want to be clear about that because I think some people reading this will expect a scene where I'm standing on the sidewalk watching it happen, some cinematic moment where I'm present for the final act. That's not how I operate and it's not what I needed. I'd made my decisions. The process was going to complete itself without my supervision. That's what doing it correctly means. You build it well enough that it doesn't require you to stand over it. Rule was there. I'd asked him to document everything on my behalf, not for any legal purpose, just because I wanted an accurate account from someone I trusted to give me one without editorializing. He called me afterward and walked me through it in the same flat, precise way he delivered everything. I listened. I didn't ask him to repeat anything. Here's what happened. The family left the penthouse in pieces. Morel first. She'd stopped talking entirely somewhere in the last few minutes of that meeting, and by the time the elevator came she was just moving, automated, like someone who had used up everything available to them and was now operating on baseline function alone. Garen put his hand on her back as they walked out. He didn't look at me again before the elevator closed. I respected that. It was a dignified exit under circumstances that didn't deserve dignity, and he managed it anyway. Tinsley left without a word to anyone. I noticed that specifically when Rule told me, not that she was dramatic about it, just that she walked out and didn't speak, which for someone whose primary mode of existing in any situation had always been commentary, said something. Colby was the last one out of the building. The family had been given proper legal notice well in advance of this date. Priya had made absolutely certain of that. Certified mail, confirmed receipt, the full statutory window observed without a single shortcut. There was no procedural ambiguity, no grounds for challenge on process. Everything was exactly as it was required to be. When Colby reached the house, the deputies were already working through the property. Standard procedure. They'd been through this before and moved efficiently. The locks were being changed on the front door when he arrived, and that's when it happened. Rule described it without dramatizing it, which is the only way I could have received it. Colby watched them change the locks, and something in him that had apparently been holding on through the penthouse meeting and the drive over and every step up the front walk simply gave out. He didn't confront the deputies, didn't make a scene that required management. He just went down, sat down in the grass on the front lawn and started screaming. Not words, just sound, the kind that comes from somewhere below conscious thought. Neighbors came to their windows and stayed there. The deputies exchanged a look and kept working. Garen stood on the walkway with a box of things they'd been allowed to retrieve and didn't move toward Colby, just stood there watching him. Rule said it went on for several minutes. I received that information and I sat with it, and I felt, not what I expected to feel. Not satisfaction. Not relief. Something quieter and less clean than either of those. Something adjacent to the feeling you get when a thing you've known was coming finally arrives, and the arrival confirms everything but doesn't actually complete anything inside you. It just is. It just happened. The fraud case had been formally opened 2 weeks prior. The fabricated bank statements, the metadata extraction, the full financial trail from Rule's report, all of it submitted to the appropriate division through Priya's office. She expected charges within 60 days. I had no ongoing role in that process. I'd handed them the documentation and stepped back. The legal system would do what it does at its own pace. The dangerous creditors Colby still owed from the gambling network, that was a problem I had zero intention of managing for him. He'd created it entirely on his own, and he'd navigate its consequences entirely on his own. I had deliberately acquired only what I needed. The rest I left exactly where it was. Kale & Sons Construction entered receivership the following week. Equipment sold at auction. Active contracts transferred to competing firms or dissolved by mutual agreement. The vendor relationships Garen had spent 30 years building, gone in about 10 business days. The name itself, Kale & Sons, ceased to exist as an operating entity. There was no dramatic announcement. It just stopped appearing in any active filing. Vonta Holdings retained its position throughout and closed the liquidation cleanly. The net proceeds from the family home and business assets were modest in the context of what Vonta manages, not a significant financial event for the firm. I directed a portion of those proceeds to a legal aid organization that specifically assists workers in wage theft cases. Employees who get what I got done to them, numbers manipulated, records falsified, their credibility dismantled so someone else can take what belongs to them. I didn't announce it. I didn't want credit for it. It just felt like the right place for that specific money to go. I've been in a different city for 8 months now. Different professional circles. No social media presence. I've never felt the pull of it, and I feel it even less now. When the story moved through certain professional networks, and it did, because these things travel in contractor and financial circles regardless of what you intend, I didn't comment on it in any direction. Let it be what it is. I think about my father sometimes. Not constantly, not in a way that interrupts things, just occasionally. Garen was a man who built something real from nothing and then handed the keys to the wrong person because that person knew exactly how to stand next to him and look trustworthy. There's a particular kind of grief attached to watching someone you respected make a catastrophic mistake and being completely unable to prevent it, especially when that mistake was also done to you. I don't know how to resolve that neatly, and I'm not going to pretend I do. What I know is that accountability and grief aren't mutually exclusive. Garen made choices. He made the choice not to ask a single question when it mattered. That choice had consequences. I can hold both of those things at the same time, the grief of what he was to me, and the reality of what he did, without needing one of them to cancel the other out. The same goes for Morel. For Tinsley, each of them made choices that had their own specific weight. I'm not carrying that weight for them. I circle back sometimes to the moment I walked out that front door. Duffel bag. The sound of Tinsley's camera still running behind me. Colby standing in the kitchen not meeting my eyes. What I said to him on my way out wasn't a threat. I want to be precise about that because the word choice matters to me. It wasn't a promise in the dramatic sense either. It was just a statement of something I understood about the nature of what he'd done. Lies constructed the way Colby built his don't hold indefinitely. They require constant maintenance. New lies to support old ones. New documents. New performances. New people to manage. Eventually the structure gets too heavy and the thing it's built on top of, the original deception, the core of it, starts showing through. He choked on it. It took 4 years. I spent those 4 years working overnight doc shifts and reading forensic accounting textbooks at a folding table and building something real with people who operated with integrity. I came out the other side with a functioning firm, a specific set of skills I didn't have before, and the complete documented truth of what was done to me, truth I was able to hand directly to the people equipped to act on it. I'm not going to tell you that makes me a better person. I don't know if it does, and I don't particularly care about that framing. It made me a more precise one. It made me someone who understands that patience applied correctly is more powerful than any reaction I could have thrown at that kitchen table 4 years ago. I don't feel victorious sitting here writing this. I don't feel hollow either. I feel like a man who knew exactly what was taken from him, took his time, and got it back in a form that nobody could argue with, challenge, or walk back. If that makes me cold, fine. Cold kept me moving for 4 years when warm would have gotten me nowhere. That's the whole story. Thanks for reading. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you really like our videos, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Have a great day.